June 17, 1972. The Watergate Hotel stands silent in the pre-dawn darkness of Washington, watching as 5 men in business suits and surgical gloves fumble with lockpicks at the Democratic National Committee headquarters. They do not yet know they are about to trigger the greatest constitutional crisis in American history, a crisis that will consume a president and forever alter the relationship between the American people and their government. But to understand how Richard Milhous Nixon arrived at this moment, we must travel back 3 decades. To a young Navy lieutenant returning from World War II with burning ambition and inexhaustible resentment. Nixon's early political career reads like an American success story written in bitter ink. Born in 1913 to a working-class Quaker family in Yorba Linda, California, he clawed his way through Whittier College and Duke Law School, never quite fitting in with the Eastern establishment elite who would later become his obsession and his nemesis. His political rise began in 1946, when he defeated 5-term Congressman Jerry Burris through a campaign marked by aggressive anti-communist rhetoric and innuendo. 2 years later, as a freshman congressman investigating Alger Hiss, Nixon discovered his gift for political theater and his willingness to weaponize suspicion. The Hiss case made him a national figure, the young crusader who exposed communist infiltration at the highest levels of government. It also established a pattern. Nixon won not through charm or vision, but through the systematic destruction of his opponents. By 1952, at just 39 years old, he had secured the vice presidency under Dwight David Eisenhower. When accusations of a secret political slush fund threatened to destroy his career, Nixon delivered the famous Checkers speech, a masterful performance that mixed self-pity, defiance, and middle-class symbolism. He saved his political life by making Americans see him as one of them, perpetually struggling, perpetually aggrieved, perpetually fighting against mysterious, powerful forces. The next 8 years as vice president deepened Nixon's understanding of power while intensifying his paranoia. He watched Eisenhower's effortless popularity with envy, studied foreign policy with genuine brilliance, and nursed his grievances against the press, the Kennedys, and the entire liberal establishment that treated him as crude and unworthy. According to historian David Greenberg's analysis in Nixon's Shadow, this period crystallized Nixon's worldview. Politics was war, enemies were everywhere, and only the ruthless survived. The 1960 presidential campaign against John Fitzgerald Kennedy became Nixon's defining trauma. He lost by the narrowest of margins, just over 100,000 votes out of nearly 69 million cast. Nixon believed, with some justification, that fraud in Chicago and Texas had stolen his victory. He also absorbed a more painful lesson from the televised debates. Image mattered more than substance. And America preferred the smooth Kennedy style to Nixon's sweating, shifty-eyed intensity. His attempted comeback in 1962, running for California governor, ended in humiliating defeat in a bitter press conference where he declared, "You won't have Nixon to kick around anymore." Political observers wrote his obituary. The comeback seemed impossible. Yet Nixon possessed perhaps the single most valuable quality in American politics. He never quit. Through the mid-1960s, while the country tore itself apart over Vietnam and civil rights, Nixon methodically rebuilt his reputation, traveling tirelessly for Republican candidates, positioning himself as the steady hand who could restore order. When 1968 arrived with urban riots, assassinations, and the Democratic Party collapsing in chaos, Nixon presented himself as the answer to Middle America's fears. His campaign promised peace with honor in Vietnam and spoke to the silent majority of Americans who felt betrayed by the cultural revolution sweeping the nation. On November 5, 1968, Richard Nixon won the presidency, completing one of the most remarkable political resurrections in American history. The boy from Yorba Linda had finally claimed his destiny. The question was what he would do with it hand, what it would do to him. Nixon entered the White House in January 1969, carrying not triumph, but vindication, a crucial distinction that would shape everything to follow. Where other presidents sought to heal and unite, Nixon sought to defeat and humiliate. His administration would achieve remarkable foreign policy successes while simultaneously constructing an apparatus of domestic, political warfare unprecedented in modern American governance. The accomplishments were substantial and historically significant. Nixon and his national security advisor, Henry Alfred Kissinger, pursued détente with the Soviet Union, dramatically reducing Cold War tensions through strategic arms limitation talks. In February 1972, Nixon became the first American president to visit the People's Republic of China, a diplomatic masterstroke that reshaped global geopolitics and demonstrated genuine strategic vision. These weren't merely photo opportunities. They represented fundamental shifts in how America engaged with its adversaries. Domestically, Nixon's record defied simple categorization. His administration created the Environmental Protection Agency, expanded Social Security benefits, proposed a guaranteed minimum income, and enforced school desegregation more aggressively than his Democratic predecessors. The Nixon who governed often seemed at odds with the Nixon who campaigned, a moderate pragmatist trapped inside a paranoid warrior's psyche. But beneath these achievements, something darker was metastasizing. From his first days in office, Nixon viewed the presidency as command headquarters in a permanent war against enemies both real and imagined. The press, anti-war activists, Democrats, liberal academics, bureaucratic holdovers from previous administrations all became targets of an increasingly elaborate campaign of surveillance, harassment, and sabotage. The war in Vietnam consumed Nixon's presidency as it had consumed Lyndon Baines Johnson's before him. Despite promises of peace with honor, Nixon expanded the conflict into Cambodia and Laos, triggering massive protests at home. When the New York Times began publishing the Pentagon Papers in June 1971, a leaked study exposing years of government deception about the war, Nixon's paranoia reached fever pitch. Though the Pentagon Papers covered previous administrations and didn't directly implicate him, Nixon perceived their publication as an attack on presidential authority itself. This context is drawn from the archives of the Washington Post's reporting during the Watergate era, which documented how the Pentagon Papers leak triggered the creation of the Plumbers, a secret White House unit. Tasked with stopping leaks and gathering intelligence on enemies, led by former FBI agent G. Gordon Liddy and ex-CIA operative E. Howard Hunt, the Plumbers operated outside normal channels, reporting directly to senior White House staff, including John Daniel Ehrlichman and H.R. Haldeman. The Plumbers' first major operation targeted Daniel Ellsberg, the defense analyst who had leaked the Pentagon Papers. On September 3, 1971, they broke into the office of Ellsberg's psychiatrist, searching for information to discredit him. The burglary found nothing useful, but it established a precedent. The White House would use illegal means to destroy anyone perceived as a threat. As the 1972 election approached, Nixon held a commanding position. The Democratic Party was fragmenting between its traditional working-class base and the anti-war movement. Senator George Stanley McGovern, who would become the Democratic nominee, represented the party's leftward shift and seemed certain to lose decisively. Nixon's re-election appeared virtually guaranteed. Yet certainty wasn't enough. Nixon's political team, led by Attorney General John Newton Mitchell, who resigned to run the committee to re-elect the president, mockingly dubbed CREEP, orchestrated an extensive campaign of political espionage and sabotage against Democratic candidates. They forged letters, leaked false information, disrupted rallies, and infiltrated campaigns. The operation wasn't about winning. Nixon would win regardless, but about total victory, complete humiliation of enemies, absolute vindication. This hunger for political destruction led directly to the Watergate Hotel on that June morning. The 5 burglars weren't desperate operatives attempting a last-ditch effort to save a failing campaign. They were instruments of a president who believed himself above the law, attempting to bug Democratic offices because Nixon could never trust victory without first ensuring his enemy's total defeat. The break-in wasn't necessary. That was precisely what made it so damning. The 5 burglars, Bernard Barker, Virgilio Gonzalez, Eugenio Martinez, James Walter McCord Jr., and Frank Sturgis, were arrested at 2:30 in the morning on June 17th, 1972, carrying $3,500 in sequentially numbered $100 bills, cameras, and electronic surveillance equipment. Security guard Frank Wills had noticed tape over door latches and called police. What should have been a minor embarrassment for the Nixon campaign would instead become the thread that, when pulled, unraveled an entire presidency. The initial cover-up was swift and confident. White House press secretary Ron Ziegler dismissed the break-in as a third-rate burglary attempt. Nixon publicly denied any White House involvement. Behind closed doors, the president ordered a full-scale operation to contain the scandal, using the CIA to block the FBI's investigation by claiming national security concerns. On June 23, just 6 days after the break, Nixon and Chief of Staff Haldeman discussed using the CIA to stop the FBI from tracing the money found on the burglars. This conversation, captured on Nixon's secret recording system, would become the smoking gun tape that finally destroyed him. For months, the strategy appeared successful. Nixon won re-election in November 1972 with one of the largest landslides in American history, carrying 49 states and capturing more than 60% of the popular vote. McGovern won only Massachusetts and the District of Columbia. Nixon had achieved his vindication. The Watergate story seemed buried beneath the avalanche of his victory. But two Washington Post reporters, Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein, refused to let the story die. Guided by an anonymous source they called Deep Throat, later revealed to be FBI Deputy Director William Mark Felt Sr., they traced the conspiracy from the burglars to creep officials to the White House itself. Their reports throughout late 1972 and early 1973 revealed a pattern of political espionage, illegal campaign contributions, and cover-up attempts reaching the highest levels of government. January 1973 brought Nixon's second inauguration, but also the trial of the Watergate burglars. When Judge John Joseph Sirica expressed skepticism about the claim that the burglars acted alone, pressure mounted on them to reveal who had ordered the operation. In March, burglar James McCord broke, sending a letter to Sirica claiming that senior Nixon officials had prior knowledge of the break-in and that perjury had been committed during the trial. The revelations came in cascading waves. White House counsel John Wesley Dean III, realizing he was being positioned as the scapegoat, began cooperating with prosecutors. In April, Nixon was forced to accept the resignations of Haldeman, Ehrlichman, and Attorney General Richard Kleindienst. Dean was fired. Nixon addressed the nation on April 30th, accepting responsibility for the actions of his subordinates while continuing to deny personal involvement. The Senate established a select committee on presidential campaign activities, chaired by Senator Sam James Ervin Jr. of North Carolina. The televised hearings, beginning in May 1973, transfixed the nation. Americans watched as a parade of Nixon officials described an administration obsessed with enemies lists, political sabotage, and covert operations. Dean testified that he had discussed the cover-up with Nixon directly at least 35 times. Then came the revelation that changed everything. On July 16, 1973, Alexander Porter Butterfield, a former White House aide, testified that Nixon had installed a secret recording system that automatically taped all conversations in the Oval Office. Suddenly, the question of what Nixon knew and when he knew it could potentially be answered definitively. The existence of the tapes transformed the scandal from a murky web of accusations and denials into a straightforward legal battle. Would Nixon be forced to release recordings that might prove his guilt? Special Prosecutor Archibald Cox demanded the tapes. Nixon refused, claiming executive privilege. The constitutional confrontation had begun. The country watched as American democracy faced its greatest test since the Civil War. Could a president be held accountable when he controlled the apparatus of government? Would the institutions of American justice prove strong enough to check presidential power run amok? October 20th, 1973, became the day the Nixon presidency entered its death spiral, an evening that would be remembered as the Saturday Night Massacre. Special Prosecutor Archibald Cox, a Harvard law professor appointed to investigate Watergate, had refused Nixon's order to stop pursuing the White House tapes. Nixon commanded Attorney General Elliott Lee Richardson to fire Cox. Richardson refused and resigned. Nixon then ordered Deputy Attorney General William Doyle Ruckelshaus to dismiss Cox. Ruckelshaus also refused and resigned. Finally, Solicitor General Robert Herron Bork, now acting Attorney General, carried out Nixon's order. The public reaction was volcanic. Western Union reported receiving more than 150,000 telegrams at the White House. It's the greatest concentrated response in the company's history. Support for impeachment, which had been a fringe position, suddenly surged into mainstream political discourse. the House of Representatives began considering impeachment proceedings. Nixon had demonstrated that he would destroy anyone who threatened him, and in doing so, he had revealed the depth of his desperation. The mounting pressure forced concessions. Nixon appointed a new special prosecutor, Leon Jaworski, a Texas attorney who proved no more tractable than Cox. The legal battle over the tapes continued through multiple courts, with Nixon releasing partial transcripts, heavily edited versions that only raised more questions. Phrases like expletive deleted became darkly comic symbols of Nixon's obscenity-laced private conversations and his attempts to sanitize his record. By spring 1974, the Watergate investigation had metastasized into multiple scandals. Vice President Spiro Theodore Agnew had already resigned in October 1973 after pleading no contest to tax evasion charges related to bribery schemes during his time as Maryland governor. Nixon's tax returns revealed suspicious deductions, prompting his infamous claim, "I am not a crook." Investigations revealed illegal campaign contributions, abuse of the Internal Revenue Service to harass political enemies, and the plumber's earlier crimes, including the Ellsberg psychiatrist break-in. On July 24, 1974, the Supreme Court ruled unanimously in the United States v. Nixon that executive privilege could not be used to withhold evidence in a criminal investigation. Nixon had to release the tapes. The justices included 3 Nixon appointees: Harry Andrew Blackmun, Lewis Franklin Powell, Jr., and William Hubbs Rehnquist, though Rehnquist recused himself, alongside Chief Justice Warren Earl Burger, also a Nixon appointee. Even Nixon's own Supreme Court had turned against him. The House Judiciary Committee, chaired by Representative Peter Wallace Rodino, Jr. of New Jersey, began formal impeachment proceedings. The televised debates showed the constitutional process working as designed, soberly, methodically, with Democrats and Republicans wrestling with the profound gravity of removing a president. According to historian Stanley Carno's comprehensive account in Vietnam, a history, several committee Republicans expressed genuine anguish at the prospect of voting against their party's president. On July 27th, the committee approved the first article of impeachment, charging Nixon with obstruction of justice. On July 29th, they approved a second article for abuse of power. On July 30th, a third article for contempt of Congress. The votes were bipartisan, several Republicans joining Democrats in each instance. Nixon still might have survived. He retained support among die-hard loyalists who viewed the entire affair as a partisan witch hunt. Some Republicans argued that his offenses, while troubling, didn't reach the level of high crimes and misdemeanors required for conviction. Then, on August 5, 1974, Nixon released the transcripts of the June 23, 1972 conversation with Haldeman, the smoking gun tape. It proved beyond question that Nixon had known about the cover-up from the beginning and had personally directed the obstruction of justice. His remaining support collapsed. Republican leaders informed Nixon that he would certainly be impeached by the House and convicted by the Senate. Richard Nixon had run out of options. The fighter who never quit, who had clawed his way back from political death multiple times, faced his final, unavoidable defeat. The question was no longer whether he would fall, but whether he would take the presidency itself down with him. On the evening of August 8, 1974, at 9 o'clock Eastern Time, Richard Nixon addressed the American people from the Oval Office for the 37th time as President Tan the Last. His family sat nearby, daughter Julie and Tricia fighting tears. Nixon's voice was measured, his face composed despite the emotional devastation evident around his eyes. "I have never been a quitter," he said, his words heavy with the weight of surrender. "To leave office before my term is completed is abhorrent to every instinct in my body. But as president, I must put the interest of America first." The next morning, August 9, 1974, Nixon delivered his farewell speech to the White House staff in the East Room. The discipline that had characterized his resignation speech crumbled into something raw and revealing. He spoke ramblingly about his mother, his failures, his father's struggles. "Always remember," he told the tearful staff members, "others may hate you, but those who hate you don't win unless you hate them, and then you destroy yourself." It was perhaps the most profound statement of his career, an acknowledgement of the self-destructive obsession that had consumed his presidency, delivered moments before he boarded Marine One for the last time as president. At 11:35 that morning, as Nixon's helicopter flew toward Andrews Air Force Base, Gerald Rudolph Ford Jr. took the oath of office as the 38th President of the United States. "Our long national nightmare is over," Ford declared, words that resonated with a country exhausted by constitutional crisis. Nixon, meanwhile, flew to his estate in San Clemente, California, a disgraced exile from the capital he had fought his entire life to conquer. On September 8, 1974, President Ford granted Nixon a full and unconditional pardon for any crimes he might have committed while in office. The decision was enormously controversial, contributing to Ford's defeat in the 1976 election. But Ford believed the country needed closure more than it needed a spectacle of a former president on trial. Nixon would never be criminally prosecuted for Watergate. 25 other officials, however, faced justice. Attorney General Mitchell, Chief of Staff Haldeman, Domestic Affairs Advisor Ehrlichman, and Counsel Dean all served prison time, along with numerous others involved in the conspiracy. The Watergate scandal sent a clear message that presidential authority had limits, and that those who abused power would face consequences, though notably not the president himself. Nixon spent his remaining 2 decades in a careful campaign to rehabilitate his reputation. He wrote books on foreign policy, counseled subsequent presidents on international affairs, and slowly transformed from disgraced pariah to elder statesman. By the time of his death, in April 1994, presidents and dignitaries from both parties attended his funeral, praising his foreign policy achievements while carefully navigating around his domestic crimes. The legacy of Watergate rippled through American political culture in profound and contradictory ways. Congress passed reforms, including the War Powers Resolution, the Budget Control Act, and amendments to campaign finance laws. Investigative journalism enjoyed a golden age, with reporters viewing themselves as watchdogs of democracy. Public trust in government, already declining from Vietnam, plummeted and never truly recovered. The Suffolk Gate became permanently attached to scandals of all types and sizes. Yet perhaps the most troubling legacy is what Watergate failed to resolve: the question of presidential accountability. Nixon's pardon established a precedent that sitting or recently departed presidents might be above criminal prosecution. Later, presidents would test the boundaries of executive power in ways Nixon might have recognized. The imperial presidency that Watergate was meant to check would resurface in different forms under different administrations. Richard Nixon died believing history would vindicate him. Instead, history has recorded him as the only president forced to resign, a brilliant strategist, destroyed by his own darkness. His story remains a parable about the corrupting nature of power, the importance of institutional checks, and the danger of leaders who view democratic opposition as existential warfare. In the end, Nixon in the den cornered, dangerous, lashing out, destroyed not his enemies but himself.